2, and this is the I suppose I shouldn't have the Golden Gate Bridge in my background. Let me just correct that. Why does this not? There we go. I really haven't been out in California in about 6 years, so let me start again. Today's date is February 28th, 2022, and for the record, this is the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee. We have 3 bills on our agenda today. We'll be starting out with Senator Gazelka, Senate File 2573. Senator Gazelka, and let the record show we do have a quorum, but every one of our bills today we plan on laying over. Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for hearing Senate File 2573. Just as I start out, Mr. Chair and members, last year Minneapolis had 655 carjackings. St. Paul had 102, and then a number of them around the states, but again, a number that is off the charts. I think it's as a result of the shortage of police officers and little consequences for this dangerous offense. This crime is at a crisis level in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Many believe it's a lack of action that has allowed things to get worse. I did go on site for one of these carjackings the day of or the next day. I was invited to go down there and just watch what was happening, and it's just become a brazen act over and over and over, and it's incredibly dangerous. I mean, if you're mugging somebody to take their car, the chances that there could be something even worse only grows. So this bill, Senate File 2573, is an answer to that cry for help that I've heard from many. So I just want to walk through it. First of all, the basics of the bill. Minnesota currently doesn't have a carjacking listed as an offense in the criminal code. Instead, prosecutors would charge out other crimes, usually robbery, but sometimes assault or some other offense. This bill puts carjacking into law. So basically, threatening the use of violence to steal someone's car, and then takes the current 3 levels of robbery crimes that would normally apply, simple or aggravated robbery, and adds 5 years maximum statutory penalty for each one. But I think the big part that I wanted to focus on is it imposes a mandatory minimum sentence for each of them, either 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years, whether it's simple or aggravated. And so that's what the bill is about, but I do want to talk about some issues that I hear as questions, and maybe this will save some time. Why is this crime so much worse? Why should we increase the statutory maximum by 5 years? That's something I want to address. And I would say stealing a car is so much more than simply taking the property of another person without permission. It's much, much more than that. Carjacking is essentially stealing another weapon. It's a large vehicle that can inflict damage on others and be used for more crimes. Stealing a car takes away someone's ability to get to and from work, so it's far more than mere theft, particularly when it's committed by violent means. Another question I have is, why don't we have mandatory minimum penalties in statute? Why is it appropriate if we don't do that often? Why is it appropriate here? And I would say judges and prosecutors continue to let dangerous criminals back on the streets with barely a slap on the wrist. That's why I'm doing this one. That's why I have a minimum sentence for a second felony with a gun. With the fiscal note, it goes on to say that 23% of robberies, not just carjacking, all robberies, apparently have a downward departure granted by prosecutors and judges. That was on page 12 of the fiscal report. And so there's a trend for downward departures that I think is part of the problem. To me, this does not sound like the problem is simply crimes not being solved, but also prosecutors and judges not charging or sentencing appropriately to protect the public safety. Because they aren't taking violent crime seriously, the legislature will have to intervene, and this gives them explicit guidance about how seriously violent crimes like carjacking should be taken. And then the third one, and then Mr. Chair, I'll be open for questions, but carjackings, the question is, well, carjackings are not being solved, so what's the point of increasing penalties? So I think it was last week that you heard testimonies that up to 80% of auto theft and carjackings are not being solved. And some newspapers say it's even higher than that. Even if this is true, the data from the sentencing guidelines in the fiscal note would suggest that there are a significant number that are being solved where the person is not going to prison right now under this violent conduct. And that was on page 11, it talks about 356 robberies sentenced in 2019. The last year we have the full non-pandemic data. The number where the property stolen was a vehicle is not exactly known, but according to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA, there was 3,898 robberies reported by law enforcement in 2021, of which 42% were carjacking. So therefore, it should be assumed that 42% of the robberies committed after the effective date of this bill will be subject to the bill's penalties that we have in this legislation. It is assumed that those carjackings will be distributed by degrees consistent with the distribution of robberies sentenced in 2019. And I just have one more paragraph here. The fiscal note goes on to say that 23% of robberies, not just carjackings, all robberies, have had a downward departure granted by prosecutors and judges. And I think that's the part that's driven me to take this and move this forward, and that was on page 12. This doesn't sound like it's just simply a problem of crimes not being solved, but it's also that prosecutors and judges are not charging sentencing appropriately to protect the public safety. So, Mr. Chair and members, that's why I'm coming forward with this bill, Senate File 2573. Well, like I said, when I actually went to the grocery store in Edina and walked through what actually happened with 4 people targeting an elderly woman with an expensive car and beating the tar out of her and trying to steal the car, and then being stopped by a Good Samaritan that parked their car in front of them so that they couldn't leave. And then another Good Samaritan with the permit to carry took out and pointed at them, and that's what caused them to flee. But that led me to say this is like the Wild West, and if we don't take control of this and have consequences that make a difference, I think the problem will only continue to grow. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Gazelka. I believe you have an author's amendment, A3 amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Would you want to describe that? Or, well, it is an author's amendment, but there's a lot of citations in it. I'd like to know a little bit more about it. Why don't we move it, and then we'll have counsel describe it.
Thank you.
Since this is an author's amendment, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The amendment is adopted. I believe Senator Johnson moved that particular amendment. All right.
I heard
it. You had to reveal that, didn't you? I think that's health record data. Mr. Backus, were you listening in on our conversation regarding a description of what the A3 amendment is?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So the A3 amendment, under current law, as Senator Gazelka mentioned, basically this bill takes what would be either simple or aggravated robbery. If it falls within the purview of the bill, it makes it carjacking. So under current law, either simple or aggravated robbery are referenced in numerous statutory provisions. So the A3 amendment essentially adds the corresponding carjacking crime to those same provisions where, again, aggravated or simple robbery are already mentioned. So it includes things like, definitions of crimes of violence, et cetera. But it was somewhat of a mechanical process to put it together. We just want to make sure that the new carjacking crime, essentially, in terms of cross references, is treated like current robbery crimes.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Backus. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak for or against this bill? I see that Chief Matt Gottschalk from Corcoran is here. Please come up to the table. Chief Gottschalk, welcome to the committee. Would you identify yourself for the record, and then you can proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Matt Gottschalk. I'm the Director of Public Safety in Corcoran, and I'm here testifying on behalf of the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association today. Our association represents over 300 police chiefs and law enforcement leaders from across the state of Minnesota. In short, we support Senate File 2573 and thank Senator Gazelka for bringing out the bill forward. As many of you have heard in the committee and seen in the news, we're seeing a dramatic rise in auto thefts and staggering increase in violent thefts. And, a lot of these situations, as were pointed out, aren't just people warming up their cars. Many of them have violent elements to them. Depending on the data, since 2018 to 2021, motor vehicle thefts are up anywhere from 60 to 80% in just those, in Hennepin County, in just those 3 or 4 years. And it's a staggering increase. I haven't seen anything like those kinds of increases in my 20 years in law enforcement. And I think to make matters worse, we're also seeing the violent elements come up during that, either the use of a weapon or physical assault. So it's something we take seriously, and I think this bill is going to be a big part towards trying to make some progress on turning that tide back in our community's favor.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
We'll open it up for committee discussion. Senator Bingham.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a quick question, or I guess comment. Senator Gazelka, the prosecutor, and I'm not a lawyer, but prosecutors don't downward depart. That's a judge. So I don't know if that, just wanted that to be clear. They have to go with what we pass. A judge makes that, and jury makes the other determinations. The other just kind of point I want to make is, have the county attorneys been consulted on this, and do they support this provision?
Senator Gazelka.
Mr. Chair, Senator Bingham, I did talk to one county attorney outside of the Twin Cities that asked me why I want to be moving forward with this, and I talked about the rise in carjacking, the dramatic rise, and the fact that at least prosecutors in this area have not apparently been taking stronger action. And he asked if there was any way, frankly, that you could just focus on the Twin Cities, but that's the one I talked to.
Yeah.
Senator Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know you already acknowledged that these bills will be laid over, so we won't be voting on it. But I would be, if these are going to be included in a larger bill, I think they should be hopefully at the testifiers table, either by request or, I can certainly reach out to, but they should have an input and an opinion on these bills that are coming forward here. So the other point I want to make, and I'm not sure if this is right or wrong, I personally, think that what's going on is extremely scary and it's unacceptable. And so having these conversations like we've had the last few weeks have been very important and insightful. And so I think it's important to continue to have these conversations, but I will also say it seems like it's coming back to the fact that we have a retention and recruitment problem, right? And we're not able to solve the crimes because we have fewer police officers on the street being able to investigate the crimes and stuff. So I think that the types of bills we're hearing today are tools, but I think it keeps coming back to the recruitment and retention issue that I know we've talked about. So I do have a bill for that, would appreciate a hearing. I could talk to you offline about that, Mr. Chair, but I just hope in the future, if this is included, that the County Attorneys Association would be requested to come in and testify on it, because I think it's, they'd probably have some things to want to say about it if it's going to move forward.
Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you, Senator Bingham. Yes, Senator
If I
Gazal.
can just comment, yeah, and it's trying to deal with some of the things that I can try to act on right now. I intentionally didn't address anything about people under age 18, even though, there is a process that they could be charged as adults. But I think that's another area that, frankly, why are they not going to delinquent centers? Why is there not help for them there? That's a whole nother issue. But when I see something that we can actually move the needle on, then I want to do it. And I do think this is one where there appears to be no sense of consequence for carjacking. And I think the fact that we're in the top 5 as far as the least amount of prison time, whether they're 49th or 48th or 47th, I think that to get a handle on this, we're going to have to be tougher on crime, and that may move that needle a little bit. But with the number of carjackings that we have so high and so dangerous, we've got to take some action.
We have next Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Senator Gazelka, when I think of prosecution or I think of crimes being committed, I'm really surprised there isn't a law already specifically to carjacking. I mean, I think when you can name it something, then there should be a case. I think it makes it harder when you have to put together a couple of other areas. So, in your opinion, do you think by offering this, the fact that there is an actual carjacking law on the books specified with minimums and so on, do you think this might be help us to be more effective in the prosecution when you actually have the actual offense in statute?
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, Senator Kiffmeyer, I do think it does send a message that we have identified this as the legislative body as an area that we think needs attention and we need to get a control on. And so I don't even know if I mentioned that the minimum sentence then for the simple robbery and carjacking is 2 years. And then if you're aggravated robbery, whether it's first degree or second degree, it's going to be 4 years or 6 years. But it sends a message that we've highlighted carjacking as a major problem that we want our prosecutors and judges to pay attention to.
Mr. Chair, I think it's important to realize that carjacking in and of itself is a very violent act with great deal of risk and danger to the public, to the people in the car, potential children in the car, elderly people in a car. I mean, this, when you look at robbery or sometimes even aggravated robbery, it doesn't have that personal risk, danger that carjacking, just by its very nature in doing that. So thank you for offering the bill. Certainly as somebody who would like to come down to the Twin Cities and do a little bit more, the fact that this is going on for my constituents, they're staying away from the cities. They really do not feel safe. And I think the fact that there's actually a bill to this shows just how much it's happening right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
In person.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good afternoon, Senator Gazelka. I'm trying to sort through this, and I'm reading through the bill, and I'm reading through the data that was provided by Senator Gazelka and was in the fiscal note. And trying to get a handle on this. So the suggestion is that there are already in law the crimes of simple robbery and aggravated robbery. And they're in 609.24 and 609.245. And they already are felonies. And they already have 10, 15, and 20-year maximum penalties with, I think, $20,000, $25,000, and $30,000 maximum fines or something like that. And the proposal is to increase the maximum penalties by 5 years for each of those three different existing robbery crimes. So I think one question is, do we think that an additional 5 years on the maximum end of the penalty will make any difference in terms of deterring future carjackers from committing that crime? And I know it'll have an impact on the sentencing guidelines and maybe what box or range of sentences proposed by the guidelines if someone were to be convicted. But I think that's probably, that additional 5 years at the top end of what's already a 10, 15, or 20-year crime is not going to have much of a deterrent effect. I think the bigger issue is probably the solve rate. We've been provided with information, according to a Fox 9 story here that's in our packets, 90% of the reported carjacks in Minneapolis go unsolved. And this bill will do absolutely nothing to increase the rate of solving those crimes. Now, some of the earlier bills that we've had to improve recruitment and retention of police officers, that might help, because hopefully we'll get more uniformed officers on the street, more uniformed officers behind the desk doing investigations, more ability to solve the crimes, which I think is a far greater deterrent than changing the maximum penalties. But other than the fact that this bill targets motor vehicles, as I see it, and Senator Gazelka, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's any other element of the crimes that are different between this bill and simple or aggravated robbery. Is that right?
Senator Gazelka.
Mr. Chair, Senator Latz, it does identify specifically the use of a vehicle as drawing attention to that specifically for carjacking. Otherwise, no. And just I'll answer the other questions that you posed as well. The top end is at the discretion of the prosecutor and the judge, is where they're going to come to whether they think they want to have a tougher sentence. But on the bottom end, the vast majority are not getting that minimum 2 years, minimum 4 years, or minimum 6 years, which is why I'm putting that minimum in. And my hope with you is that we're going to have more police. I really do think that's the biggest thing. But the second thing is that the person doing this becomes aware that now there's actually a very, very serious consequence. You will go to jail if you're carjacking. And at this point, I think word on the street is that's not the case. And so that's where I think more police, we're going to catch more people doing this, and the message is out there that we're going to be tougher on crime.
So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I thank you, Senator Gazelka, for the additional explanation, but my question had to do specifically with the rate of solutions of solving crimes, and I don't see anything in the bill that would change that. But Senator Gazelka, you did mention something about downward departures, and Senator Bigham is absolutely right. That's not, the prosecutors don't do that unless they are, unless they're supporting a downward departure, which is fairly rare in the criminal justice system. But that's a decision the judge makes. But you cited a statistic, Senator Gazelka. I'd like to know where it came from and if there's a further breakdown. Because you said 23% of all robberies, when they are sentenced, result in downward departures. Do you know what percentage of the robberies that involve the property taken as being a motor vehicle resulted in downward departures? Because that's really the relevant reference point here.
Senator Latz, if I could bring your attention to page 12 of the fiscal note, paragraph 3, there's the reference to the 23% received mitigated dispositional departures. That's on existing robbery cases.
Page 12 of the fiscal note?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is the fiscal note in our packet? Oh, there it is.
I believe it is.
There it is, yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, did the fiscal note break down robberies involving motor vehicles versus robberies involving other properties?
Why don't we ask our fiscal analyst if he could answer that?
Thank you.
Did you hear the question of Senator Latz?
the fiscal note that says 23% of all downward departures are relating to robberies, does it break that down in terms of what type of property is taken, motor vehicles versus other property?
Mr. Turner.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Latz, no, it does not.
So,
Senator Latz.
you know, that could have involved, I mean, and that's, let's see, existing robbery cases. So let's go to existing statute and take the lowest level felony robbery, which is any personal property from the person or in the presence of one another and uses or threatens the imminent use of force against any person to overcome the person's resistance. So if a criminal goes up to a guy walking down the street and says, "Give me your wallet or I'm going to beat you up," and the guy hands over the wallet, that is simple robbery. That's a 10-year felony, $20,000 fine. And that conduct would be included in the statistics that are cited in the fiscal note regarding downward departures. That might have been the first time the criminal ever did that. It might have been because they lost their job and they didn't have income to pay for food for their families. We don't know. And there are a lot of reasons why people take wallets, or purses for that matter. And that's why we have judges who have authority under the sentencing guidelines to downward depart. Because not every downward departure, or not every robbery deserves jail time or prison time. Or at least we can conjure up hypothetical facts, which the judges are dealing in real time every day and making those judgment calls. There may be extenuating circumstances that warrant the downward departure. And if it's only 23%, actually, it seems to me that's not a real concern to me. And, you know, so I can see, I mean, what if all 23% of that is the lower level simple robbery, where it's a purse snatching or it's a wallet grabbing, and the other 77% of robberies that are sentenced are within the guidelines recommendations. So it seems to me that's not really a helpful reference point for our analysis here today. Mr. Turner seems to has something to add to that.
Mr. Turner's itching to get involved in this discussion. So, Mr. Turner.
Senator Latz, I'm not itching, but I reread the
Well, that's a good
assumptions here.
sign, actually.
I don't know if I even want to enter this, but I'm rereading this, Senator Latz, and back the assumptions that precede where they talk about 23% receive mitigated departures. And, okay, it does read, of the 356 robberies sentenced, the number where the property stolen was a motor vehicle is not known. According to the BCA, there were 3,898 robberies reported by law enforcement, of which 1,645, 42%, were carjacking. It's therefore assumed that 42% of the robberies committed after the effective date will be subject to the bill's penalties. I think it's that 1,645 number that is continued in the Sentencing Guidelines Commission's calculations.
Mr. Turner, can you point me to the page where
Senator Latz.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman,
Turner.
Senator Latz, I'm on page 11.
Okay.
Down the last full paragraph where they set out their progressive assumptions to come up with their final numbers.
So, Ms. Turner,
So-
just to clarify, in 2019, this report is attributing 1,645 incidences of robbery were carjacking. Am I reading that right?
Yes?
That's how I read it.
All right.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Senator Latz.
I think it'd be helpful maybe if whoever did the analysis or drew the data here, maybe it was the Guidelines Commission, if they could clarify whether the 23% is a carryover on only the subcategory of carjacking, or whether the sentence that's written here is broader than that, of the existing robbery cases. So I think it'd be helpful to know.
Yeah, Senator Latz, Director Wright was planning on being here, but he's ill today, so we'll make sure he comes forward when we revisit this issue
Thank you, Mr.
after
Chairman.
layover.
Yeah, that'd be helpful to help with the analysis. So, and I understand, where Senator Galzalko went with the second part of this, which is really, I think, where the teeth is in the bill, is the mandatory minimum sentences. And I guess I've said this before, but as a matter of principle, I'm not a fan of mandatory minimum sentences. I mean, there's a reason why we have judges, there's a reason why we have the sentencing guidelines, which is supposed to factor in all sorts of criteria, much of which the legislature has already set forth in statute, and some of which is more specific to what the Guidelines Commission did to come up with their grids. And while the idea is to create a box with a range of sentences that are within the guidelines recommendations, and to identify the midpoint of X number of months for that, and also identify where there's a presumptive commit versus a presumptive stay of prison time, which doesn't mean no jail, it just means any jail time would be less than a year and a day. Could be 365 days in the county workhouse. And that would be a departure in some, depending where you land on the grid, or it might be within the presumptive stay. But there's a reason why we have that more detailed analytical framework for determining what sentences are appropriate, and then we give the judges a certain level of discretion if they're able to identify certain criteria that would, under the law, justify a downward departure. And the problem with mandatory minimum sentences is it literally treats every situation identically. Even when everyone in this room or watching on Zoom could come up with a narrative of an offense that is a little bit different than the narrative of the offense the person before them came up with. And it's the job of the judge is to figure out, is that difference something that is significant enough that the guidelines doesn't really give you justice in the end, that justice really is a lesser sentence, or in some cases a greater sentence. I mean, there's criteria to go both directions. But that's the judge's decision with the input from the prosecutors, the defense counsel, if they're represented by counsel, probation, which does, in all felony cases, does a pre-sentence investigation, typically a level 4 pre-sentence investigation, which is the most thorough and extensive of the person's history, background, verifying criminal history, whether there's chemicals involved in the history or involved in the offense itself. I mean, all sorts of criteria go into that, which you simply cannot account for in a statutory minimum sentence. So what you could end up doing is creating a lot of injustice by putting a statutory minimum sentence into the statute. And it's easy for us to sit here and say, everyone who does this act ought to go spend 2 years in the slammer without knowing anything about that individual person. So I just have a problem with that. And the other problem with the bill is it goes beyond statutory minimum sentences or mandatory minimum sentences. I mean, the bill undermines a whole range of our criminal justice principles in paragraph B of subdivision 3. On page, starting at line 2.4, it says, notwithstanding, it lists a whole bunch of different sentencing statutes. It eliminates the defendant's eligibility for probation, for parole, for discharge, for work release, or supervised release until that person has served the full term of imprisonment. In other words, all of the tools, I mean, it's standard in our correctional system for almost every commit to the prisons that they serve 2/3 of the sentence in custody, and then they are released to transition into the community. And when they transition to the community, they're provided with services. We have a robust, although not well enough funded, probation system that tracks and works with every defendant when they're released from prison to provide them with support so they can get housing, to provide them with support so they can continue to deal with any chemical dependency issues that they may have had when they went into prison, some of whom might have gotten some treatment in prison, but there's a lot more need for it than there is funding for treatment in prison. And provides them with educational help, helping them deal with all sorts of things. And when they're in prison, there is a work release program actually in the state prisons that allows people to go through boot camp, for example, or to go out in the community and do work release in the community to help them gain some of the life skills while they're in prison so that when they get out of prison they can be successful, or more likely to be successful. The way this bill is written, there's going to be a cliff. Person's going to spend not 2/3, but 100% of the executed time in jail. And when they walk out the door, they're going to get nothing. Nada, bubkas, no support whatsoever when they walk out that door. They probably won't even get enough money for a bus ticket to go wherever they're going from there. I mean, they will literally walk off the cliff. They won't have probation providing any of the supervised release. They won't have any of the community supports that are offered by probation or parole officers. They're not going to have any transitional assistance while they're in prison to gain some of the, like work release, to help gain skills to be more successful when they're released. They're not going to be guided by probation through chemical dependency, and if they have some problems, they're not going to have someone there to help them, hold their hand, give them the guidance when they're gone, because their entire sentence would have been executed and done with. And to me, that just undermines and contradicts the entire concept that we have of our criminal justice system here. In the name of just slamming the door on them for as long as possible. And actually, you know what will end up happening as a result of this? Probably. Judges are going to look at that. They're going to find some way, if they don't think that's right, where they might have given a 10-year sentence, they might give a 7-year sentence instead. And prosecutors are going to be facing decisions as they're negotiating with defendants and defense counsel who are going to say, this is so harsh, it's never going to work. No one's going to plead guilty to anything with this kind of a situation. And they're going to either be trying more cases, they're going to find other ways to work around this because this is a completely unworkable provision in the bill. And this will be dealing with people as young as even a 16 or 17-year-old that's tried as an adult is going to be faced with this provision if they get convicted. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess I've gone on for a long time with the critique of the provisions in front of us, but I just don't think it's going to solve the problem we're trying to solve.
Mr. Chair.
While I agree we need to solve the problem, I think this creates more problems than it actually will solve. Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to ask Mr. Backus, is it correct that anyone that would be sentenced under this particular provision, does that negate any transitional support or at least anticipated direction as an inmate would be approaching his release date? Are we creating a void in any transitional counseling at all, as Senator Latz suggests?
Mr. Chair, members, this provision is boilerplate language that we add to mandatory minimum sentences. It incurs in a number of, we don't use mandatory minimum sentences that often, as has been discussed, but when we do, we add this sentence or two sentences, whatever it is. What it means really is, and it's confusing, I understand that, but what it means is a person, basically the sentence has to be executed and the person is not eligible for probation or discharge earlier than the full term of imprisonment. However, the full term imprisonment is considered 2/3. So it's true that Senator Latz said that the offender wouldn't be eligible for, say, work release or anything like that, but the offender would still get out after 2/3, as is the case for any felony offender.
Okay.
Right.
That's very helpful to know, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Matthews. Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Gazelka, did you want to make a response?
Just briefly, because Mr. Chair and Senator Latz, I do support pathways to rehabilitation, so that's why I'm listening to what you have to say. Same thing with minors. But the fact that we're somewhere between 45th to 49th as far as incarceration rates, least amount of prison, I think that we have to balance what we do towards the criminal versus the citizen that's being now the victim. And that's why I say with 655 carjackings, it's out of control, and we need to focus on how do we get that control back. And I think a number of us have talked about how do we get more police on the streets, but I do think sending a message related to the penalty related to this is important. It's off the charts out of control.
Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate the robust debate we're having on this provision. And I understand, I actually agree with one of Senator Latz's points that ideally, in a perfect world, I wouldn't want to support mandatory minimum sentences either. Wouldn't want to necessarily be a fan of that, but I'm also not a fan of something else. I'm not a fan of violent offenders that are getting spun back out without any repercussion or consequences and have gone out and reoffend. And it's been happening over and over and over again just in the recent past, to the point, and it's not talked about very often on the media, but there are independent journalists and people that are out following this information and are trying to track these things down, and they're discovering cases like this on an almost daily basis now, Mr. Chair. And that's why we're seeing the types of spikes, not only in the cities, but around the state here recently as well. A recent, very publicized court decision laid out, a judge very clearly and plainly laid out that there are actually 4 key pillars that judges consider in deciding what sentence to give. And one of them we've talked about here pretty regularly. In this hearing, we've brought up multiple times, that being deterrence. But there are other pillars that judges consider in deciding what should be handed out. Another one is retribution. How much should a convicted person pay for the harm they inflicted on the victim? Another one's incapacitation, physically removing a person out of society so that they are unable to commit any more violent offenses on the same or any new victim. Rehabilitation, how much time might it take for that person to try to reform himself or herself and become a law-abiding citizen? I actually think this meets the deterrence measure itself. If the person's not there or faced with an even stronger penalty, I hope that might make some double guess their own actions before they make that act. But I think it meets that and the other standards that judges have looked to for incarceration. And Mr. Chair, I'll end with one last point as another reason why I'm supporting this bill, and that's from news stories that we've heard every so often in the hundreds of recent carjacking cases that have come. Included in those have been stories of people that had sometimes pets driven off with in the vehicle, and even worse, children. And as a parent of a young child myself, it was immediately the first thing I thought of, just the shock and horror that would hit me if I were in that situation. Just how much I would be beside myself if I were placed in that and it was my car that someone attacked me for and jumped into, and it was my son sitting buckled up in his car seat in the back seat. And I know that that brings a whole new element, new charges and all of that. But with the sheer number of carjackings that have gone up, the sheer number of other unforeseen circumstances of other children or pets or other belongings in the car has also gone up with it. And I think that we need to swing the pendulum back the other way. I think there are too many that are getting let out early, and I think, at least for the time being, since the spike continues to go at a high level here, I think the pendulum needs to swing back, and there needs to be a very strong statement that this behavior is not okay, and you're going to be thoroughly convicted and punished for these types of violent actions on our citizens. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And frankly, I think it's probably more than a spike. It's nearly a pandemic, and I thank Senator Gazelka for bringing this forward. Some of the discussions that have been going on are a little troubling. A person would steal a car because they don't have a means of living. We can make all kinds of hypotheticals as to why they steal cars. We could even say that, well, the person stole a car so he could find a way to go to work and provide for his family. We all know better than that. We all know what's going on here, and who's actually being forgotten. And Senator Gazelka, I'm glad you brought that up, is the victims. The victims are very sick and tired. The people that I represent, and the majority of the people that we all represent, we don't represent criminals. We represent the folks that pay the bills and actually go to work and not commit crimes. They're the ones that are kind of going unheard of here, not getting a lot of attention. And right now, they're wondering why this open door policy, this swinging door thing, is going on in our state. And, I'm quite surprised, Senator Latz, that you're okay with 23 or 26% of these cases, robbery cases, being departed downward. I'm surprised. I'm quite surprised. I certainly would not be in favor of that. I don't think the general public would be in favor of that. And with regards, and one last point, with regards to the prosecutors do have some input, I think, on downward departures. I don't play in that arena very much myself, but I know that's a fact. And if the judges think this is going to be too harsh and they're going to take things onto by themselves, then I think we need to remind them just exactly who they work for. So, members, this is a great bill. I think the mandatory minimum is something that we've needed for some time here now, and I think it will send a strong message. And the public safety is what we're talking about here. And I think this is certainly a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Senator Ingebrigtsen. I wanted to remind our membership that we still have 2 more bills to take care of in the next 39 minutes. So having that advice, we'll move to Senator Johnson.
I feel like that was a suggestion or perhaps a warning. No, I just wanted to briefly kind of work through a situation too. If it is a sympathetic defendant within this, typically a prosecutor, and I guess maybe this is a question for Mr. Backus on this as well, is if it's a sympathetic defendant, are they going to be charged out on multiple charges such as robbery, aggravated robbery, or carjacking, and might be able to reach a plea deal that doesn't put them into the category of this minimum sentencing?
Mr. Backus.
Mr. Chair and Senator Johnson, if the person is convicted of this new crime, they will get a mandatory prison sentence. That is not discretionary. I imagine, though, that the prosecutor might retain the option of charging the person with maybe a different offense if the facts, would apply to that. But again, if the person is charged or convicted of this new crime, they would get the mandatory penalty.
Senator Johnson.
Mr. Chair. So, but if they plead earlier and plead to a lesser, robbery or whatever it might be, they would not be convicted. The prosecutor wouldn't continue the prosecution based on carjacking, right? And would be a lesser sentence of robbery or something like that. Is that correct, Mr. Backus?
Mr. Chair and members, yeah, I think that would be correct. I mean, obviously a prosecutor would be in the best position to talk about that. But yeah, I think they would be able to, again, just exercise some discretion in terms of maybe what the offender is either charged with or actually pleads guilty to.
Thank you. That's all.
Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak for or against this bill? Seeing none, this bill will be laid over. And we'll move on to number 2 on our agenda, Senate File 3352, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members.
Thank you, Senator Gazelka. Welcome, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair and members, I have Senate File 3352. It's a bill that could go hand in hand with the last bill we heard or other bills related to carjacking. And this one is for having the data that law enforcement agencies report to have a specific column for carjacking data to the Commissioner of Public Safety and have this published in its own specific column in their annual Uniform Crime Report. In Minnesota, law enforcement agencies and other criminal justice partners give information on crimes committed in their districts to the Department of Public Safety and to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and the BCA compiles it into an annual Uniform Crime Report. This crime report has lots of information, but contains very helpful information about what is happening in different areas around the state. So one of the questions that has come up over and over again in the last couple of years is the large increase in carjackings. Because carjacking is currently considered a part of the crime of robbery, it has not always been reported separately or with an accurate picture as to what percentage of the whole of robbery carjacking entails. Several agencies have now begun to track this data separately, but I believe it would be helpful to understand the overall pictures across the state and have all our agencies report this information and have the BCA include it in one place in their annual crime report. Because this report's already created, I don't believe it will be a huge change to add this one category. And if a bill on a carjacking crime like we just heard gets passed and enacted into law, I think it would be even that much easier to specifically track this data itself. So with that, Mr. Chair, I believe Chief Gottschalk is also going to come say a few words to this bill as well, and I'd appreciate the committee's support.
Chief Gottschalk. Welcome back to the committee. And as before, would you identify yourself for the record and then proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Matt Gottschalk. I'm the Director of Public Safety in Corcoran, and I'm here testifying on the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association, representing over 300 law enforcement leaders across the state. Our association supports Senator Matthews' bill that would require us to report carjacking data. We believe there's a lot of data missing as we examine crime and accountability in our state, and this data would help us analyze things across the state and get a better understanding of what's happening, as opposed to trying to pull together from multiple data sources in multiple ways of recording. So we support the bill, and we thank Senator Matthews for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Chief. We'll open it up for question and discussion. Anyone? Senator Bigham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Matthews, I actually like this, but I have a couple questions. It doesn't have an effective date on it, or like when you want the report done. It says annual, obviously, but like where it starts, when it would be effective. So I'm wondering about that. And then just more of a general thing, maybe for you, Mr. Chair. So I'm reading the definition of carjacking as described in the previous bill and then in this bill, and they kind of don't match up. So we may want to have a very, similar and concise definition of carjacking if we're going to do it. If we're going to put it in, if we're going to proceed with making it its own crime, we probably should make sure everybody is on the same page with what that description and definition is.
Senator Bigham, that's a good catch. Thank you for bringing that up. Do you understand that, Senator Matthews?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Bigham, excellent point. I believe that since we are laying these bills over, the final product should get consolidated and should be done to match the differing perspectives that different senators have brought in. So I appreciate the suggestion. I think we'll do the same with the effective date. I believe August 1st is the default date if none is given, but we can check that and make sure if that's appropriate or if another date is appropriate when we do the final version.
Senator Bigham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Matthews. It's just that if this isn't a crime yet, we kind of have to have some time pass before they can start reporting on them. So you may need to push that out or something. If it's not a crime yet, they can't really report on that. So I guess keep that in the back of the mind too.
We'll keep it in mind as we proceed. Any other questions or discussion? Anyone in the audience who wishes to speak for or against this bill? Hearing none, Senate File 3352 will be laid over.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And the final bill, this is a re-referral from Transportation. And this is Senate File 1513, Senator Dibble. Welcome back to the committee, Senator Dibble.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is actually my first in-person bill presentation this year, so it's a pretty auspicious event.
Well, we'll be the judge of that, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I appreciate your time and your willingness to hear Senate File 1513. This is an effort to address issues of safety and security on transit in the metro area. And it's attempting to do that in a way that is both effective in both the long term and the short term. What the bill seeks to do is build on successful strategies that Metro Transit has already used to address issues presented by those on transit who are struggling with homelessness, for example. Rather than just using enforcement and punitive measures, it seeks to be a more holistic in its approach and response. It also borrows from research and best practices from other places. And the idea, Mr. Chair and members, is to create an atmosphere on transit that is clean, safe, secure, and orderly for all riders, and to address behaviors and hold people accountable while also recognizing that there are often very complex issues at play which left unaddressed in all likelihood will reoccur. There are two main components to the bill. One is to allow for the non-payment of a transit fare to be subject to an administrative citation rather than the full criminal level misdemeanor that now occurs. And also creating a cadre of non-sworn, what we call transit safety officials who can do a variety of things. Issue these administrative citations, be a calming presence, which is a preventative measure, de-escalate situations or get police there if they need to, and help people find what they need, whether it's directions or access to social services or whatever. To the administrative citations part of the bill, it would be a $35 citation that would be payable in about 90 days. It allows for an appeal process. It provides for alternative forms of resolution, whether that be community service or something else. Has some provisions for subsequent offenses. The fines generated would be used to support the overall program. And the reason for this idea is because misdemeanor citations, which of course we know are a criminal offense, add to one's criminal record, is paradoxically seen as almost self-defeating in some senses because the level of the crime is viewed as so disproportionate to the nature of the offense. It's almost never pursued by prosecutors or in the courts. And issuing these citations, which can only be issued by cops, takes up a lot of police officer resource and time. There are other elements of the bill, some that are not quite as related to those two major thrusts of the bill. One is asking counties to pay for much, if not all, of the program. There's a requirement that Metro Transit publish a code of conduct, establish paid fare zones, not always on board, but zones where you wait for transit, facility monitoring. There's some reporting requirements. There's a provision towards the back which would ban offenders from using transit who have committed more serious offenses for different periods of time. There's a requirement that the complement of police, of sworn personnel, be maintained by Metro Transit. So that's a high-level overview, Mr. Chair. There are three people who would like to provide some brief testimony if we're ready to move there.
Thank you, Senator. We'll move to Leslie Condaras. Welcome to the committee. Would you identify yourself for the record and then proceed?
Yes, Chair Limmer, my name is Leslie Condaras, and I work at Metro Transit as the Chief of Staff. And good afternoon, Chair, committee members, and Chair Limmer. Thank you for hearing Senate File 1513 today, and thank you, Senator Dibble, for carrying forward this bill. As Metro Transit's general manager testified in this committee back on February 9th, Metro Transit is seeking authority to issue administrative citations for transit fare non-payment as part of our broader approach to improving public safety on transit. And Section 4 of Senate File 1513 includes administrative citation authority. Allowing Metro Transit to treat fare non-payment as an administrative violation instead of as a criminal violation would provide us with a new tool that will really help us increase official presence on our system and also allow our police officers to focus on crime and other serious public safety issues. Just for some background, most of Metro Transit's rides are taken on buses where you pay to ride when you get on board. But about a third of our rides are on rail or bus rapid transit lines where you pay off-board to ride. And it's on these off-board payment or these proof of payment lines where we routinely conduct fare enforcement. And as Metro Transit works to expand our network of transit lines, the share of off-board payment is going to continue to grow over time. Under current state law, riding transit without paying a fare is a misdemeanor and carries a $180 fine. Currently, Metro Transit police officers are the only transit personnel who inspect fares and write citations for fare non-payment. Administrative Citations Authority would allow Metro Transit to use employees who are not police officers to conduct these duties. And this approach really has two main advantages for improving public safety. First, with Administrative Citation Authority, we would be able to increase official presence on our system. We would increase official presence by hiring and assigning new non-sworn personnel to inspect fares and issue administrative citations. These non-sworn personnel would also receive customer service training. They would be interacting with passengers. They would be riding our trains and our buses and on platforms. And as Senator Dibble mentioned, they would be available to answer questions, help connect people to social services, and also help alert the Metro Transit Police Department when they witness unlawful or dangerous behavior. Ultimately, we believe that this additional official presence really could help us deter crime and violations of our existing code of conduct. But second, in addition to increasing official presence on our system, administrative citations would allow us to relieve police officers of routine fare enforcement duties. As part of the materials the committee received today, you received a letter from Metro Transit Police Chief Eddie Frizzell. In his letter, Chief Frizzell outlined his support for moving to administrative citations for fare non-payment. He noted that this aligns strongly with the 21st century policing goals to build trust between citizens and officers. By assigning fare enforcement to non-sworn staff, our police department would be able to address more serious issues that do require police response. Basically, it will provide them more time to do this and more flexibility. As you'll likely hear from other testifiers today, other transit systems across the country have moved to this approach of using non-sworn personnel to inspect fares and are enjoying success with this approach. And Metro Transit wants to move in this direction as well. But until state law is changed, continuing the practice of having police officers inspect fares and write citations really is our only option to address fare non-payment. And ultimately, we realize that there is no one solution to address the issues we're experiencing on transit. Administrative citations alone will not fix all of our problems or concerns that we hear from our customers and other stakeholders. But we do believe this authority will be one powerful tool to help increase presence and improve overall conditions on the system. Thank you again, Chair, and appreciate your time today and would be available to answer any questions.
Thank you. I think we'll hold questions until after all of the testifiers. We'll now move to Mr. Will Schroer. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Did a great job.
Thank you. Please identify yourself for the record and then proceed.
Chair Limmer and members of the committee, my name is Will Schroer. I'm the Executive Director of East Metro Strong. Thank you for your time here this afternoon. East Metro Strong is a public-private partnership between cities, counties, and large employers in the East Metro. And those employers and governments and their citizens recognize transit as one of the important parts of a successful transportation system. When this idea, actually a proposal along these lines was first raised in the legislature a couple of years ago, our board was discussing this approach, and I was asked what I knew about this approach being used elsewhere, and did I think it was a good idea, and much more importantly, had other agencies tried a similar approach, and if so, was there anything we could learn from them as we decided, as these governments and employers decided whether to support this idea here in the cities or not. It turned out that to the best of our knowledge, folks in Minnesota had not done a lot of research on the subject, that it was being pursued for other reasons, and we were encouraged to do some of that research, and I'd like to share it with you today. There's a couple of pieces in your packet. I'm not going to ask you to page through them, but if you would like to, you're certainly welcome to. The first big piece of research into this general approach was done in 2012 by the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board, and they recommended a three-part set of best practices. One is that a transit police focus on policing, that fare enforcement is done by staff that are not sworn officers, and that fare non-payment is pursued through a civil or administrative approach. So that was in 2012, and the bill in front of you follows those recommendations. Since 2012, a number of other transit agencies have pursued those recommendations, and our research approach was pretty straightforward, although I have to say a little time-consuming. We called the chiefs of police in other transit agencies that had implemented this approach and asked them to share their experience with us. And to a person, They said it was working well. They endorsed the approach, and in fact, they were recommending expanding or otherwise continuing the approach. So that's the bottom line finding from our research, is that around the country, the approach recommended in this bill is being pursued successfully, found successful, and as it happened just this morning, I got a little text from a colleague in Philadelphia who said that SEPTA had just announced expanding their program just this morning. So sort of an ongoing process. I'd leave you with a couple of additional thoughts and then welcome any discussion that would be helpful to you. To say that this is a national best practice is not to say that there are not variations among agencies. The primary variation is that agencies pursuing this approach definitely separate policing from other staff duties, as has been outlined. After that, there's a further division in some agencies. Some agencies do, as is being proposed here, that there is a one kind of staff that does fair enforcement and customer engagement and social service, et cetera. That approach is successful for many of these agencies. Other agencies do a further division into just fair enforcement and then everything else. And those agencies find that approach works well as well. So I'm not here to pick one of those, but to share research with you. But overall, certainly our board endorses the general thrust of this proposal, which is to let police and to follow the successful example, as we've learned, of other agencies around the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Suzanne Sabatka. Welcome to the committee. Will you identify yourself and then proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, members. My name is Suzanne Sabatka, and I am the Policy and Research Director at Move Minnesota, a nonprofit advocating for Minnesotans to use transit, biking, and walking and rolling as their preferred means of transportation when those modes work well, and we advocate to improve those modes when they do not. I first want to express my enormous gratitude to have this opportunity to discuss Senate File 1513 today before the Judiciary Committee. We are hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel of the COVID-19 pandemic, which means many Minnesotans will soon need to make plans for how they will travel to get to work, school, recreation, and all the other facets of daily life. At the same time, global economic pressures could soon drastically increase the cost of gasoline. And we know when gas prices spike, more Minnesotans choose to travel by light rail and bus. So there is urgency in addressing how to make transit a safe and welcoming place for all. As you have heard from Mr. Schroer, a very common way to create that safe and welcoming atmosphere is to supplement public safety efforts with transit agents. Transit agents, combined with the creation of an administrative penalty for fare non-payment, will go a long way to ensuring there are more eyes and ears on our transit system. We believe ultimately the best way to make Minnesotans feel safe and confident using transit is to have more people present in using the system. Further, the creation of the administrative penalty for fare non-payment ensures that Metro Transit Police are available and able to respond to public safety situations that require their attention. Metro Transit conducted a survey of their own law enforcement officers this past fall and found that a majority of transit police did not think that fare enforcement was a good use of their time. This sentiment rings especially true given how seldom prosecutors are interested in pursuing misdemeanor charges for fare non-payment. They have more serious criminal cases to occupy their time and attention. Finally, we believe the creation of a civil administrative citation penalty underscores the need for fairness and equity when it comes to charging fare non-payment as a misdemeanor crime. Failure to pay your transit fare should be considered no more serious a crime than other infractions, such as failure to pay a parking meter. Again, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation here today. We'll look forward to continuing the discussion on improving safety for all on our transit system, and I'll remain available for questions.
Thank you. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak for or against this bill? I see none. Senator, my question, Senator Dibble, is how did you arrive at the $35 penalty? I understand that in existing law, if it was a misdemeanor, it would be as high as $180, or is that a starting point or a max? Nevertheless, $35 seems quite a departure from $180. Could you give us a little insight on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually should have invited Senator Newman to co-present this bill because the vast majority of the language actually is his language, which was brought in by delete all amendment at the Transportation Committee. He had a lot of ideas around a lot of the elements of this bill, so it's very, very different than was originally drafted, and I don't even think there was an amount identified. There was just an authorization to the Met Council, and then they were going to figure it out later, I think, in the bill as introduced. So I don't actually know the answer to that question. That was a Senator Newman idea. I should have asked him that.
Thank you, Senator Dibble. One of the other questions I had in looking at this possibility a year ago or a little bit longer is the question that these individuals who would be the people on board that would be given this authority, they're not sworn police officers. And I'm a little concerned about their potential safety. We've been hearing reports of more serious criminal activity on light rail within the metropolitan area. And I'm a little concerned that these individuals, since they don't have that police authority, may become victimized themselves. Has there been discussion in the Met Council regarding that angle on the proposal?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Not specifically with respect to as connected to their authority to issue administrative citations for failure to pay fares. There is discussion about the kinds of skills and what they're there to actually do and who these people even are in the first place. And, I'll invite Ms. Canderas up if she has any insight into this or related questions. Part of the idea, part of the original idea was to create this concept of transit ambassadors. You and I have discussed that. Mm-hmm. And these would be people who would come from a variety of communities and have, quite a few skills inherent as well as skills that they're trained in, being a calming presence, being, having the ability as members of particular communities who have some authority, have de-escalation, have the ability to anticipate certain behaviors based on observation, the ability to call in cops if they need police help fairly quickly, and that sort of thing. I can't say that, with respect to your specific question, that I'm aware of, there's been any discussion about that. I don't know if Ms. Canderas has any insight.
Ms. Canderas.
Yeah. Chair Limmer, Committee, Senator Dibble. From a Metro Transit perspective, the safety of all of our employees is a top concern. And so as we've been thinking about how we would approach having non-sworn personnel on the system, we know they're going to have a really strong relationship with our police department as well as our operators and other staff on the system. So certainly taking that into account when training them and when developing approaches to deploy them on the system would be top of mind. So just wanted to note it very much is a big concern of ours is how we protect the safety of all employees, including this new class of employees.
Yeah. Senator Dibble, I believe you and I both share the idea that in order to have a good light rail system, it has to be perceived as a safe light rail system. And, I've noticed the news incidences where bus drivers on our buses sometimes get attacked. I know that the drivers of light rail, the ones that are in the cockpit, are pretty much sealed off from the rest of the population that are riding. But this particular type of person would either be on platforms or they'd be riding in the cars themselves. And they're not in a protected bubble, let's say. And so that's what I'm concerned about. And perhaps as we pursue this later this session, we're going to lay this bill over. We can have a more in-depth discussion about it and maybe give me a little more comfort on it. Senator Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Dibble, for the bill presentation today. It's good to see you back. One question I had just on Section 6 here. You have a mandatory minimum within your bill regarding folks who commit gross misdemeanors and felony violations within transit. We've heard a little bit about minimum mandatories today. However, would you talk a little bit about the mechanism for enforcing that? How would you identify the individuals and enforce those mandatory minimums?
Mr. Chair, this is another Newman special, so I don't know specifically, Senator Johnson. It's a great question. I don't have the answer. I think it would be a challenge. I'm guessing that it would be more of an after the fact. I think it would be pretty hard to prevent someone proactively from stepping onto transit, unless you're using Senator Limmer's favorite biometrics ID, monitoring our comings and goings throughout the public. I'm just kidding. Something that Senator Limmer and I have in common are some serious protections around that kind of activity on the part of the public sector. But I would suspect it would be one of those, if you get caught, then you're in big trouble kind of a thing.
Any other discussion regarding Senator Dibble's bill? Hearing none. Thank you, Senator Dibble. This bill will be laid over. And there's no further business before this committee. We stand adjourned. Thank you.
Appreciate your time, Mr. Chair, members.